The house had always been a dream, a symbol of achievement, love, and a fresh start. I could still remember the day I held the keys for the first time. It was a modest home, nestled in a quiet neighborhood, with a wraparound porch and a garden my wife, Lily, had already claimed as her own. Lily and I poured our hearts into this house, choosing every detail together, the cream-colored walls in the living room, the vintage chandelier in the dining room, even the quirky little doorknobs for the cabinets. We had painted, hammered, and polished every inch of it, imagining it would be the backdrop for countless memories. So, when my parents announced they were hosting a housewarming party, I was confused. At first, I thought I'd misheard them. A housewarming? I repeated over the phone, glancing around the living room. My sneakers squeaked against the freshly polished floor as I paced. For our house. Yes, my mother replied cheerfully, her voice bubbling with excitement. We're planning something special to celebrate your new home. I hesitated. That's thoughtful of you. When were you thinking of having it? Oh, next Saturday, she said nonchalantly, as though I should already know. Next Saturday. The date clicked in my head like a jigsaw piece fitting into place. I'd noticed Lily flipping through catering menus earlier in the week, humming to herself, but she hadn't mentioned anything about this. That's great, I said, trying to sound upbeat. What time should Lily and I arrive? There was a pause, just long enough for a chill to creep up my spine. Well, my mother said, her tone shifting to that patronizing sweetness she used when trying to sell me on something I wouldn't like, we've already sent out the invitations. It's mostly family and some of our friends. We thought it might be nice to keep it intimate. Intimate. It felt like she'd dropped an invisible barrier between us, one I hadn't even noticed she'd been building. You're not inviting us to a housewarming for our own house? I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop myself. It's not like that, she said quickly. You've been so busy with work, and we didn't want you to stress about hosting. I wouldn't be hosting, I replied, forcing a laugh. You just said it's your party. She chuckled awkwardly. We'll talk more later, okay? You'll see, it's going to be wonderful. Wonderful. I hung up, staring at the phone in disbelief. Next to me, the cream-colored wall we'd painted together suddenly felt like it didn't belong to me at all. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the phone still gripped in my hand. The absurdity of it all washed over me in waves. A housewarming party for my home, planned by my parents, and Lily and I weren't even invited. The house was unusually quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Lily wasn't home, she'd gone out to meet her sister for lunch, and the stillness seemed to magnify my thoughts. For a moment, I considered calling my father. He'd have the same cheery tone as my mother, I was sure, and probably the same roundabout reasoning. It's for your benefit, really. We just wanted to handle everything so you wouldn't have to. It would be like trying to argue with a smile carved in stone. Instead, I wandered into the kitchen and grabbed a glass of water, the weight of the situation settling in my chest. This wasn't about a party. It was about control. My parents had always been overbearing, but this felt different, like they were staking a claim on something that wasn't theirs. When Lily came home, I decided not to mention it right away. I watched as she breezed into the house, her cheeks flushed from the crisp air outside. She placed a small shopping bag on the counter and began unpacking it, humming softly. You're in a thoughtful mood, she said, glancing at me. I forced a smile. Just thinking about next weekend. She raised an eyebrow. The housewarming? I froze. You knew about that? Lily hesitated, her fingers pausing over a jar of pesto she'd just pulled from the bag. Your mom mentioned it when I saw her last week. I didn't know they hadn't told you. There it was, that invisible barrier again. Even my wife had been looped in before me. And you didn't say anything? I thought you were already on board, she said defensively, setting the jar down. I mean, it's a little odd, but I figured it was one of those things your parents like to do. You know how they are. I wanted to argue, to tell her how ridiculous it was, but instead, I sighed and leaned against the counter. Yeah, I said softly. I know how they are. The truth was, I didn't even know what bothered me more, that my parents had planned the party without including me, or that everyone else seemed to accept it as normal. The days leading up to the party were a strange mix of tension and normalcy. Lily tried to keep things light, asking me questions about which room my parents might show off first or whether they'd serve finger sandwiches or something fancier. But every time she brought it up, I felt a knot tightening in my chest. By Friday night, I couldn't hold it in any longer. My father called to check in, his tone as upbeat as ever. Just making sure we're all set for tomorrow, he said. I bit back my frustration. All set? We're not even invited, remember? There was a pause, the kind that's only noticeable when it stretches just a second too long. Now, son, it's not about that, he said carefully. This is for the family, to celebrate your new home. But we're not part of that celebration. I asked, the sharpness in my voice surprising even me. It's our house. We should be the ones celebrating. You're missing the point, he replied, his voice firming. Your mother and I just wanted to do something nice for everyone. We didn't want to burden you and Lily with hosting. Burden us? I repeated, my frustration boiling over. You didn't even ask. You made this decision without us, and now we're just supposed to go along with it. My father's tone shifted, his usual patience replaced by an edge I rarely heard. This isn't about you. It's about bringing the family together. I don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this. Of course you don't, I said bitterly. You've never seen a problem with taking over and making it about what you want. That's enough, he snapped, his voice rising for the first time. You're overreacting. This is supposed to be a joyous occasion, and here you are, turning it into something ugly. I felt my jaw clench, anger swirling in my chest. You know what's ugly? Being excluded from my own home. If you can't see how wrong that is, then maybe you shouldn't be throwing parties in the first place. Fine, he said coldly. If you feel that strongly, don't come. But don't blame us for trying to do something nice for the family. The line went dead before I could reply. I stared at the phone in my hand, my breathing heavy. For all my father's words about family and joy, all I could feel was the sharp sting of rejection. Lily came into the room, her face lined with concern. I heard you yelling, she said softly. What happened? I shook my head, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. They told me not to come. Her eyes widened. They said that? Not in so many words, I admitted. But it's clear that's what they want. Lily placed a hand on my arm, her touch grounding me. We'll figure this out, she said. Maybe it's time you told them how this is really making you feel. I sighed, leaning into her touch. I thought I just did. The morning of the party was unnervingly quiet in our house. Lily busied herself with gardening, her way of diffusing the tension she could feel radiating from me. I tried to distract myself with a book, but every word blurred into the next. By noon, cars began arriving at the house. Through the front window, I watched relatives and family friends pull up, their laughter echoing faintly as they carried covered dishes and gift bags to the door. My mother greeted each guest with a wide smile, her arms outstretched as though she'd orchestrated some grand event. I clenched my jaw and turned away from the window. It was one thing to be excluded, it was another to have to witness it firsthand. Let's get out of here, Lily said suddenly, brushing dirt off her hands as she stepped inside. We don't need to sit around and stew all day. Where would we even go? I asked. Anywhere, she said, grabbing her purse. A hike, a drive, even just a coffee shop. I don't care. Let's just, not be here. Her determination was enough to jolt me into action. I grabbed my jacket, and we headed out the door, leaving behind the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses that now felt like an intrusion in my own home. We ended up at a small diner on the edge of town, a place we hadn't been to since our early days of dating. The vinyl booths and the faint smell of bacon grease felt oddly comforting. "2 coffees?" the waitress asked as she approached our table. "Yes, please," Lily said with a polite smile. Once we were alone, she leaned forward, her voice low. "Are you okay?" I ran a hand through my hair, letting out a heavy sigh. "I don't know how to feel. Angry, mostly. But also, hurt." She nodded, her hand brushing against mine on the table. "I get it. It's like they've taken something that's ours and made it theirs. That's not fair." "It's more than that," I said, my voice tight. "It's the fact that they don't see anything wrong with it. My father basically told me I was being selfish for even bringing it up." Lily tilted her head, her eyes softening. "Maybe it's time to stop trying to get them to understand and just set some boundaries. They need to know this isn't okay." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at the screen to see a photo my cousin had sent to the family group chat, my parents standing in the living room, surrounded by guests. A large, welcome banner hung above the fireplace. "Looks like the party's in full swing," I said bitterly, sliding the phone away. Lily hesitated. "You know, if you're not ready to confront them now, that's okay. But you need to decide how much of this you're willing to take. Otherwise, it's just going to keep happening." I nodded, her words sinking in. She was right. But part of me wasn't sure if I was ready to take that step, or what it would mean for my relationship with my parents if I did. Lily and I lingered at the diner longer than we'd planned, each sip of coffee stretching into silence. Despite her reassurance, I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving the house that morning had been a retreat, a silent concession that I didn't have the strength to face the situation head-on. When we returned home in the late afternoon, the party was still in full swing. Cars lined the street, and the sound of laughter spilled through the closed windows of our house. I parked a few houses down, unwilling to face the crowd even from a distance. Inside the car, I stared at the steering wheel, my hands gripping it tightly. "This is insane," I muttered. "I shouldn't have to feel like a stranger in my own home." Lily reached over, resting a hand on my arm. "Then don't. Go inside. Make your presence known." I glanced at her, startled by the suggestion. "Just, walk in." "Why not?" she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's your house. They can't tell you you're not welcome here." Her words sparked something in me, a flicker of defiance. I was about to unbuckle my seatbelt when my phone buzzed again. I hesitated, then picked it up. It was another photo in the family group chat. This time, it was of my father, raising a glass of champagne in a toast. The caption below it, written by my mother, read, "To new beginnings and a bright future in this beautiful home." I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. My father's smile was wide, his arm draped over my mother's shoulder, as if they were the ones who had built this life. "This is too much," I said, my voice low but shaking. "What did they say?" Lily asked, leaning over to glance at my phone. I handed it to her wordlessly, and as she read the caption, her expression hardened. "They're acting like it's their house," she said, her voice tight with anger. "You can't let them get away with this." Before I could respond, a new message appeared in the chat. It was from one of my aunts. "Where's the man of the hour? Shouldn't he be here to toast his new home?" The question hung there, unanswered, as the chat fell silent. I stared at the screen, the flicker of defiance growing into a steady flame. "That's it," I said, unbuckling my seatbelt. "I'm going in." Lily grabbed my hand before I could leave. "Just, be careful," she said softly. "I know you're upset, but don't let them drag you into something you'll regret." I nodded, her words grounding me as I stepped out of the car. My heart pounded with every step toward the house, the sounds of the party growing louder. When I opened the door, the laughter and chatter stopped almost immediately. All eyes turned toward me, and for a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the hum of tension. "Look who finally decided to join us," my father said, breaking the silence with a forced smile. I took a deep breath, my voice steady but firm. "We need to talk." The living room felt stifling, the air heavy with the weight of dozens of unspoken words. My father's forced smile faltered as he looked around, clearly sensing the unease rippling through the crowd. "Let's step outside," he said quickly, his hand motioning toward the back patio. "No," I replied, my voice louder than I intended. "We're talking here." The murmurs in the room grew louder as my relatives exchanged confused glances. My mother stepped forward, her expression a mix of embarrassment and concern. "Now's not the time, dear," she said softly, her hand brushing my arm in a weak attempt to placate me. "It's exactly the time," I shot back, pulling away from her touch. "You threw a party in my house, and you didn't even think to include me. You didn't ask. You didn't invite me. You just decided this was okay." My father's face darkened, the easygoing demeanor he'd always worn slipping away. "We did this for you," he said firmly, his voice carrying through the room. "To celebrate your new home. And instead of being grateful, you're standing here trying to ruin it." "Grateful?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You think I should be grateful for being excluded? For watching my own family act like they own my house while I'm treated like I don't even belong here?" "Don't be dramatic," he snapped, his patience clearly wearing thin. "You're making a scene over nothing." "It's not nothing," I shouted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "This is about respect, something you clearly don't have for me or Lily. You've crossed the line too many times, and I'm done pretending it's okay." The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging heavily in the air. My father stared at me, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. "You think this is about respect?" he said, his voice low but sharp. "You're the one standing here, airing your grievances in front of everyone like a child throwing a tantrum. If you had an issue, you should have come to me privately." "I tried," I shot back. "But you never listen. You've always decided what's best for everyone without asking how we feel. This house was supposed to be our fresh start, and you turned it into your stage." My mother stepped between us then, her hands raised in a futile attempt to calm the situation. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't the time or place. Let's all take a breath in." "No," I interrupted, my eyes fixed on my father. "This needs to be said. I've let you walk all over me for years, but this is too much. You don't get to take what's mine and make it yours." The room was deathly quiet now, the eyes of every guest fixed on us. My father's face was red, his anger barely contained. For a moment, I thought he might lash out. But instead, he straightened, his expression hardening into something cold and unfamiliar. "If that's how you feel," he said, his voice icy, "then maybe you don't deserve what we've done for you." I stared at him, my breath catching in my chest. "What you've done for me?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't about what you've done for me. It's about what you've taken from me." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the stunned silence and the weight of a family that suddenly felt like strangers. The cold air hit me like a slap as I stepped outside, but it did nothing to cool the fire raging in my chest. My hands were trembling, and I shoved them into my pockets, pacing the length of the porch as muffled voices from inside filtered through the walls. Lily appeared a few moments later, her eyes wide with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. I shook my head, unable to find the words. "I don't know what I expected," I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. "Maybe an apology. Maybe just some acknowledgement that they were wrong. But instead, they doubled down," she finished for me, her tone tinged with anger. I nodded, running a hand through my hair. "It's like they don't even see what they've done. My dad, he actually said I didn't deserve what they've done for me. As if this house, this life, is something they gave me. Lily stepped closer, placing a hand on my arm. You don't have to justify yourself to them. You've worked for everything you have. This is your home, our home. No one can take that away from you. Her words were a balm to my frayed nerves, but they couldn't erase the bitterness that lingered. I glanced back at the house, the windows glowing warmly against the fading light. Inside, the laughter had resumed, though it sounded forced now, strained under the weight of what had just happened. Let's leave, I said suddenly, the decision crystallizing in my mind. I don't want to be here anymore. Not while they're still in my house. Lily hesitated, her brow furrowing. Are you sure? This is your chance to take back the space, to show them they don't own it. I don't need to prove anything to them, I replied firmly. I just need space, away from this, away from them. Maybe then they'll realize how far they've pushed me. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Okay. Let's go. We walked to the car in silence, the weight of what had happened settling heavily between us. As I pulled away from the house, I glanced in the rearview mirror, the image of my parents' party shrinking into the distance. I need to figure out how to handle this, I said quietly, more to myself than to Lily. I can't keep letting them dictate my life. Lily reached over, her fingers intertwining with mine. You'll figure it out, she said. And when you're ready, I'll be right there with you. I nodded, her words grounding me as we drove into the twilight, leaving behind the echoes of a family that no longer felt like my own. The drive felt endless, though we didn't go far. Lily suggested a quiet park outside of town where we could sit and collect our thoughts. The parking lot was nearly empty, the trees standing bare against the winter sky. We found a bench overlooking a frozen pond, and the stillness of the scene was a stark contrast to the chaos we'd just left behind. I sank onto the bench, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees, my breath forming clouds in the crisp air. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Lily let me sit with my thoughts, her presence a quiet reassurance. When I was a kid, I began, breaking the silence, my dad used to talk about family like it was the most important thing in the world. He'd say that no matter what happened, we always had each other. But now, I don't know if he believes that anymore. Or maybe he just has a different definition of what family is. Lily reached over, her hand resting lightly on my back. I think he does care, she said gently. But he cares in his way, not yours. And that's the problem, you've been living by their rules for so long, they don't know how to handle it when you push back. I let her words sink in, the truth of them settling uncomfortably in my chest. She was right. My parents had always been the decision-makers, the planners, the ones who set the tone for how things were supposed to be. And I'd let them, partly out of respect and partly because it was easier than fighting back. But this wasn't just about a party. It was about claiming my space, my life, and making it clear that I wasn't a child to be managed anymore. I need to talk to them again, I said finally, my voice steady. Not in front of everyone, not when emotions are running high. Just, the three of us. They need to hear how I feel, and they need to understand that things have to change. Lily nodded. That sounds like the right move. But don't go into it expecting an apology, they might not be ready to give you that. Focus on saying what you need to say, for your own sake. I looked at her, gratitude welling up in my chest. How did I get so lucky with you? She smiled, her cheeks tinged pink from the cold. You picked me out of a crowd. Remember? We stayed at the park until the light began to fade, the horizon painted with streaks of orange and pink. As we drove home, I felt a new sense of clarity, a quiet determination to set things right, not just with my parents, but with myself. The following morning, I called my parents. My stomach churned as the phone rang, but I reminded myself why I was doing this, not to fight, but to be heard. Hello, my mother answered, her voice cautious. It's me, I said. I need to talk to you and Dad. Can I come over? She hesitated. I suppose. Is everything okay? I'll explain when I get there, I replied. The drive to their house felt heavy with anticipation. Lily offered to come with me, but I knew this was something I had to face alone. When I arrived, my parents were waiting in the living room, their faces unreadable. My father stood as I entered, crossing his arms. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone clipped. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "It's about yesterday. About the party. About everything." My mother sat down on the couch, her expression softening. "We didn't mean to upset you," she began, but I held up a hand. "Please, let me talk first," I said. They exchanged a glance but nodded. "This house is more than just a building to me, Lily," I said, my voice steady but firm. "It's the first thing we've built together from the ground up. Every choice we made, every inch of that house, is a reflection of us. And when you planned that party without even asking, it felt like you were taking that away from us." My father frowned, his arms tightening across his chest. "We were just trying to celebrate your achievement. We didn't think." "That's the problem," I interrupted, meeting his gaze. "You didn't think. You didn't ask. You assumed you knew what was best, and you pushed ahead like you always do. But this time, it wasn't your place." My mother reached for my father's hand, her voice softer. "We never meant to hurt you. But you're right, we didn't think about how it might feel for you. I'm sorry." Her words caught me off guard, and I turned to my father, waiting. He looked down, his jaw tight. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't respond, but then he exhaled deeply. "I'm not good at admitting when I'm wrong," he said finally, his voice low. "But I can see that we overstepped. I'm sorry for that." The tension in my chest loosened slightly, though I knew this conversation was only the beginning. "I appreciate that," I said. "But moving forward, things need to change. I need you to respect our space and our decisions. If you want to be part of what we're building, you have to let us take the lead." They nodded, and for the first time in years, I felt like they were really listening. When I left their house, the air felt lighter. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, old habits die hard, and boundaries would need constant reinforcement. But for now, I felt a sense of peace. Lily greeted me at the door when I got home, her eyes full of unspoken questions. "How did it go?" she asked. I smiled, pulling her into a hug. "Better than I expected." That evening, as we sat together in the living room, the house felt more like ours than it ever had before. The echoes of the past were still there, but they no longer defined the space. It was a new beginning, not just for the house, but for us, and for me.